Hello, I'm Amin Mauji, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this episode of Conversations on the Nile, the Aga Khan Development Network's dialogue series, where we will be looking at some of the big issues of our time from our vantage point here in Uganda. Today, we're going to be taking what I hope will be a short step into the future to look at some of the predictions of what the economic terrain might look like beyond the pandemic. We'll look to see what the business opportunities might be there ahead of us, but also see whether there are some economic policies, business strategies that we should be thinking about to help us plan for the recovery. For my conversation today, I'm going to be joined by Barbara Mulwana, who is the chair of the Ugandan Manufacturers Association, who serves on many of our corporate boards here in Uganda, but is also a very successful businesswoman in her own right. We will be joined by Noah Balasanyu, who is an entrepreneur and a consultant in the digital and technology space, and I know will bring some very interesting insights and perspectives to our discussion. Technology permitting, we hope also to be joined by Kennedy Mbekyani from the African Development Bank from Abidjan, and also a senior economist from the IMF, Isabella Karpowicz, who we hope will be able to join us from Washington today. So welcome and join us today for our conversation on the Nile. COVID-19. It's the big issue of our time. It's the burning platform, if you will, that we are all facing across the globe. And of course, our world is changing as a result. We're all having to find ways to respond to this new change. But when we talk about the change that's upon us, the structural change that's upon us, much of this change seems to be an acceleration of trends that we were already seeing before COVID-19. The shift from globalization to a more regional economy, the shift from global supply chains, long supply chains, to shorter supply chains, people moving manufacturing and production to closer to home, the home markets, people moving to an economy where you've got substitution of imports, and of course you've got the digital shift, moving to a digital economy, moving to a digital way of life. And so coronavirus has, in a sense, accelerated all of these trends. And the question we are discussing today is, what can we say about the economic landscape ahead of us? I'm going to start by bringing in, before we open up, we're going to start by bringing in Kennedy Mbekyani. Kennedy heads up the African Development Bank here in Uganda. It's in Abidjan at the AFDB headquarters. Kennedy, you have a role in Uganda, but you also have a regional perspective, and it'll be very interesting for us to hear your perspectives on what is the outlook that you see going forward.
Hello, I'm glad to be joining you. In terms of regional outlook, the initial projections were between 5 to 5.5%. That was before COVID disrupted production. With COVID, the worst case scenario, we are looking at 0.2%. Best case scenario, maybe around 2%, with most of the development coming from infrastructure. So infrastructure will still be the one driving economic growth. But it really depends on how countries are going to position themselves during COVID and post-COVID. Now, COVID also provides an opportunity. During COVID, there's an opportunity to rewind, for lack of a better word, and also to reflect. And that period of reflection is to prioritize which projects need to be implemented first, and then which projects should come afterwards. But the most important issue during this COVID period is, how do we prepare ourselves to a post-COVID environment? And that preparation is one that has to be done within the factory itself. How do we restructure the factory? How do they use the opportunity to recapitalize? How do they use the opportunity to train their workers? And then at the same time, outside the factory, for government on the public sector side, how do they create an environment to actually accelerate recovery of the industry? So the outlook may look a little bit dim at the moment, but one can say that this is the midnight before the next morning, which we are going to use as an opportunity to prepare for the day after. So we feel that in as much as COVID has disrupted a number of things, healthcare, the social sector, things have been disrupted. The economic outlook, really depends on how governments are going to position themselves in terms of investing in infrastructure, the social sector, and then creating an enabling environment for private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'd like to do before we move on from the macro view is to also bring in an economist who could perhaps give us some insights and some perspectives on the economic outlook. We have with us Isabella Karpovich from the IMF in Washington, and assuming the technology can work, we can connect with Isabella to tell us a little bit about how the IMF and Isabella, you in particular, because you are about to take on a role as the resident representative here in Kampala. What's the view look like from Washington?
Thank you very much for having me on this seminar. Allow me to kickstart my comments by stepping back for a moment and so that I can lay out the context in which the recovery is taking place, both in terms of the economic developments and policies that have been undertaken, both very important for understanding what to expect going forward. So Uganda and other countries in the region have been profoundly scarred by the COVID-19 pandemics, and the disease has certainly caused a heavy toll in terms of loss of activity, deterioration in living standards, and poverty. A large part of the progress made in human development indicators over the past decade has been swept away in record time. We have seen that some sectors have suffered more than others during the lockdowns. The tourism industry and more generally leisure and services sectors have been particularly impacted. Countries where these sectors have a relatively larger share in the economy have witnessed higher growth correction, and Uganda is one of them. We also have to note that the sovereign spreads, which represent the cost at which the governments are borrowing externally for those countries that rely on external financing, have deteriorated pronouncedly and more so for Africa. And this does not bode well, particularly well with the recovery. In terms of policies, the countries in the region have reacted in a similar fashion, but with a varying degree of intensity. Partly reflecting political economic concerns and partly reflecting fiscal and monetary policy space. So, first of all, the governments have sought and have obtained concessional financing from the IMF, but from other partners, that has allowed them to implement the lockdowns and at the same time counteract the decline in revenues, increase spending on health and social protection, and sometimes even shelter businesses from deterioration in global conditions. This context is important for formulating any forecasts about the recovery. So what we have observed is that the first signs of recovery could already be traced to June this year, and they coincide with the gradual relaxation of containment policies, some improvement of commodity prices that are relevant for certain countries, and also some improvement in financial conditions. Mobility has also increased. So we still, despite this optimistic picture, we see the corrections for the year 2020 as very sharp. For instance, in Uganda, we may see the activity being flat, or we may witness even a small contraction this year. So the real recovery will take place only in sometimes through 2021. And the sectors that will be driving it are precisely the ones that have been most hit during the pandemics. And these are transportation, accommodation, tourism, financial services, and to some extent, industry as well. However, I must note that the medium-term growth prospects hinge very heavily on the return to the pre-COVID-19 structural reform agendas that the governments were implementing. It will be very important that, to maintain sound policy frameworks that allow to step up spending when needed. Economic diversification, this is something we have seen as very important during the pandemic. So these reforms will have to continue as well, which are more important for some countries than others. Reforms to use government funds more efficiently and reduce its dependence on foreign financing. So fiscal consolidation for a number of countries will certainly be imperative going forward.
Okay, well that's been interesting, Isabella. I mean, the question I suppose I would ask as a follow-on is, what are the key drivers that you see to drive this economic recovery that you speak of? Where do you see the key economic drivers?
A key driver of this equation will be the availability of external financing, including concessional financing, to ensure that debt remains sustainable. Initiatives such as the debt suspension one that was launched in May this year will help address immediate liquidity needs, and they're certainly welcome, but they will not ensure that that remains sustainable over the long period. So therefore, it is very imperative that we return to those pre-COVID-19 reform agendas.
Right. Well, we've spoken about the kind of macro view, and in a sense, what we've heard is that the sectors that are likely to drive the upturn are likely to be the sectors that drove the downturn. But what about innovation? And I'd like to get Noah into this bit of a conversation. Noah, you've been operating in the digital space, the technology space, across the whole ecosystem of what we would today call the fourth industrial revolution.
Yes.
And it'll be very interesting to get your perspective on, where are the opportunities for innovation in this market.
Thank you, Ambassador Amin, and it's a pleasure to be here. As I'll pick up from the last statement and what we're seeing, the pandemic bringing an accelerated adoption of digital. If you look at the headlines just out of many of the lockdowns, is that there's a rise in the digital consumption. Entities like Netflix had to slow down their speeds to allow the rest of the internet to function because everyone was watching at home. And we're seeing that there was a scramble to get many services online. Back here at home in Uganda, in the week just after the lockdown, we saw a scramble of Zoom licenses for people trying to get their businesses connected and the semblance of government functioning. I remember a conversation I was having with some partners and how the government had to connect all the ministers on a broadband link so that we could run government. And this is a feat that had failed Uganda for a decade. I remember the earlier conversations about how ministers are going to be using video conferencing, and it took 10 years to even get to any close reality for that. But in just the 3 weeks after lockdown, the Uganda government was fully digital. And what the pandemic has shown us is, yes, we were on that plateau, for digital transformation. But then when you can't go to your grocery store, when you can't go to your entertainment center, when you can't leave your home, the only tool available, if you have internet, is what you can consume digitally. And so that demand went through the roof. Businesses that struggle to sell items online are now selling items online. So we are continually seeing the digitization of products and services. I keep giving the example of borders. One of the characteristic means of transport that you find uniquely in Uganda and in some other African countries. Who knew that could be digitized? If I told you that borders would be functioning on an app 5 years ago, you'd laugh at me. It's like, why would where would a border person find a smartphone? But it's the reality today. It is, I can leave you a hail as easy as it is to order an Uber. I can order a border. So we have digitized the most manual and physical means of transport, which is the border, right, in Uganda. And we're going to continue seeing that trend. Those are the opportunities. Now, that carves out a new cake. So, you have the proverbial cake of the known sectors, the agricultural sector, the manufacturing sector, which is largely the playground for people who have some experience. But we're seeing a new cake, a digital cake being baked that is going to spell the next movement of value. Now value will be traded digitally. Over 98% of the global value is traded digitally. Out of the top 10 world's largest businesses, 7 of them are fully digital businesses, meaning that they, from end to end, deliver value digitally. I mean, we can talk about Apple having a physical product, but it's just ones and zeros if they don't have iTunes, if they don't have apps that they monetize. And we're seeing all this back and forth, especially Apple and Google that have been in the recent limelight because of their digital value. They take a big piece of that digital cake to the point that now Apple is one of the world's, it's the first $1 trillion company, the first $2 trillion company in the world. Where is this value coming? Digital. Why that is a big opportunity for us as Africans and Ugandans is that these new waves of technology, what you termed as the fourth industrial revolution, a combination of artificial intelligence, blockchain, big data, Internet of Things, they are now the new kings. They are now the new areas of value. And because the entire world is at the starting line, Africa is also at the starting line with the rest of the world. And so we have the unique, rare opportunity to start creating value for Africans for the next 50, 100 years. Because in the next 30 years, 1 in every 4 people is going to be African. So in the next 30 years, if you're big in Africa, you're big in the world. Because right now, if you're big in China, you're big in the world. But in the next 30 years, if you're big in Africa, you're big in the world. If you have the biggest digital platform in Africa, you have the biggest digital platform in the world. And so that's the opportunity. It's a very big cake, and it's enough for African young people. Because we're about to get into our digital dividend, our demographic dividend as Africans. And that will create both a huge population, the youth getting into the working age, but they need to put that energy into use. And I believe that digital is one of the easiest ways to do that. And COVID-19 has created a platform, an equalizer, if I may use it, for us to start thinking creatively and start acting creatively. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I mean, Barbara, you hear Noah speak of this digital transformation, yes, and the youth dividend. It's a young country, certainly. You chair the Uganda Manufacturers Association. You serve on many boards. You're a successful businesswoman in your own right. I guess much of your experience has been in what I would call traditional sectors and traditional industries. You hear Noah speak about the new world. What are you seeing in the future?
I think you mentioned the fact that we need to be hopeful. And in this pandemic, we've had a pandemic and we've had a lockdown.
Yes.
So not only has it affected our health, but it's also affected our bottom line.
Yes.
And I think to also our psyche. So given all that, how then do we as manufacturers, business people, respond to that? Well, I think everybody's talked about the fact that you have to be self-reliant and you have to be sustainable. You have to look a little bit inward to see what you're good at and what you can then change and make a contribution to improve on those three things. And in our business, I guess it's always the bottom line. And when we look at the manufacturing sector, we look at our country, Uganda, the one that we feel that has a huge advantage is still in the agriculture space. where there's so much that we can do. I mean, if you, and I've always talked about this, if you go on the shelves, all of the things that are in our shelves are still not locally made. And that's then is the advantage, and that's then is the where we can make a profit or we can make some money. An example I'll give is eggs. During this pandemic, the price of eggs moved from about $10,500, which is about $2.80, to about 80 cents, right? That was huge because of the lockdown, the hotels are closed and all this sort of things. So to me, there I see an opportunity, because what if more people were pasteurizing those eggs? If you pasteurize those eggs, you give them a longer life, a shelf life, and also gives you an opportunity to export and thereby bring get some dollars. There are actually companies. There is a company that has decided to do that, right? Which has started to pasteurize eggs because of this whole in Uganda. So I think that's where the opportunities come. Yes, we're in a challenge, but how do we then move that challenge into an opportunity? With the lockdown, obviously, like you've mentioned, our supply chains have been affected.
Yes.
Now, we all know, very simple thing, in all our industrial inputs, there's starch. Starch goes in our textiles, goes in our dairies, goes in our pharmaceuticals. Remember I talked about health?
Yes.
Now, there is another opportunity. Starch. Starch is made out of what? It's made out of cassava and it's made out of sweet potatoes. We have that. The issue is that it's really unleashing that opportunity into starting to make starch locally. But it's not going to happen overnight because it's important that farmers get into more cooperatives, more cooperation, to the point that I've mentioned about corporations. Cooperatives, because they can't do it alone. If I'm a farmer in ginger, nobody's going to listen, no banker is going to listen to me. However, if I'm 20 farmers who then have cassava that we can then convert into starch, then my risk is lower, and then people start looking at me differently. So I believe that in the inputs side, on maybe it's a lot of it is agriculture, but then with that comes industry, because you're going to need packaging, right? You're going to need to have packages. You're going to need all sorts of things. So yes, it's a pandemic, but I do believe that there's still some opportunities, especially in our agriculture value chain.
So the things you've spoken about, the starch example is a good one, but in a sense it speaks to a level of scale that makes the thing work. And you've also described the kind of entire value chain, not just the agriculture bit, but the packaging and marketing and so on. It'll be interesting to get a banker's perspective on how the private sector can help fund these things. And I'd like to put that question really to Kennedy. Kennedy, from a banker's point of view, you've heard where the opportunities are in Uganda. You've heard of some of the investment requirements to get scale in the traditional sectors of agriculture, but also manufacturing. How do you, as a banker from the African Development Bank, see the response from the banking community?
Yeah, as you're all aware, our bias as African Development Bank is in infrastructure financing, but we are also putting more resources into private sector. Now, we can bring in private sector into infrastructure financing. The opportunities that I see is, one, because the government would not have money to finance a huge backlog of infrastructure. Now, how do you come in as private sector to structure deals with government so that you do infrastructure financing? And this, we are looking at infrastructure as an investment where you're going to get returns. But private sector has to come up with ideas, not always relying on government financing. So the government will not have money, but there's a huge gap in financing. So as private sector, how do you come in? It's a huge opportunity for private sector, not only Uganda, but even in neighboring countries. If we look at Uganda private sector, where else can they do their investment? That is outside investing outside Uganda. Huge opportunities in South Sudan that they can work on. As African Development Bank, that's where we can come in to provide some elements of guarantees so that private sector can be able to invest in transitional economies, whether it's Sudan or Somalia, huge opportunities for private sector. And even within the country, value addition is an area where also private sector can do a lot of work. I just came across Nespresso capsules for coffee that is made from Uganda, but I'm sure the value addition is done somewhere else. So the question is, where else can we do value addition? Yes, I'm a great fan of advocate of import substitution, but you also have to be careful that if everyone is going to import substitute, then we're going to close the borders. So the import substitution has to be done in a clever manner without creating barriers, because if you create barriers for some of the imports, the exporting country would also do the same to Ugandan imports. So it has to be a situation where you are improving your productivity without creating barriers, because the consumer still has to have choice. If a consumer has choice, if there is competition, prices will come down, the quality will improve. But if it's import substitution by blocking others to enter the market, what we're going to have now is domestic producers fighting to get to the bottom. So because they know that they are protected, the consumers will not have any choice. The quality of the product will be very low. The prices will go up. Then that is the problem that we're going to face. And that's a problem that most countries experience, particularly in the service sector. When you don't open it up, there's one service provider and they charge monopoly prices, very high prices, and those high prices are not good for productivity. So when we are looking at production, when we are looking at exports, when we are looking at encouraging domestic consumption, domestic production, we need to think globally. We need to think outside our own country. So there are opportunities outside Uganda, there are opportunities within Uganda, but I see opportunities in infrastructure. I see a lot of opportunities in value addition, in processing the products that we are making. An interesting observation, going back to economics, the times of W. Arthur Lewis, when he was talking about unlimited supply of labor in the rural areas, which is still the same today. We see a lot of unskilled workers coming from the rural area into the cities, because the cities are the ones creating manufacturing jobs, and manufacturing jobs have a premium compared to farming. Now, the question that we need to be asking private sector and the government to say, how can we improve the rural communities? How can we create rural economic development so that we can manage migration of citizens from the rural area into the cities? There's only so much that a city can be able to accommodate in terms of population, but there's huge opportunities across the country in terms of developing rural towns. So a rural development policy, rural infrastructure is also where private sector can come in. So this value addition I'm talking about can be done in the rural areas. As a result, you're going to create jobs in the rural areas. You are going to reduce the flooding of swamps, informal settlements in the cities. This is what has been happening not only in Uganda, but across Africa. And the worst part that is happening is now, when the cities become so saturated, then the citizens now start deciding to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. And that's the tragedy that we are facing. And that tragedy is because we are not focusing on rural economic development. When you have 90% of your population in the rural areas, we really need to do something in those rural areas. They are producing bananas, pineapples, and so on, but there's no value addition. So if we can do some value addition, it could help, and that's where private sector can come in and also help in the transformation of society, not only Uganda, but across the continent. Thank you.
All right. Well, it'll be interesting, I think, to move on now to talk a little bit about the regional market and the regional dimension. I mean, my sense is that regional integration is actually taking a step back. Trade flows have certainly diminished during this crisis. Some of that may be to do with the fact that movement has been restricted, and some of it is to do with the fact that we've seen more protectionism between countries. But it'll be interesting, I think, if we have a Isabella on the line to get your perspective, Isabella, on how are you seeing the regional market shaping up?
So the pandemic has certainly caused a setback in regional integration processes worldwide. It has triggered disruption in global value chains that were perhaps unintentional. It has also prompted certain governments to turn inward and implement protectionist policies. This is truly an unfortunate circumstance because some of these measures will be very difficult to revert. We continue to believe that regional cooperation and integration is an engine for growth. However, there is a reason to be optimistic for the future. And the setback is really temporary, and in the grand scheme of things, may not mean a lot. And the reason for that is that integration processes take a long time to bear fruit. For instance, the IMF has estimated that regional trade would increase by some 80% thanks to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, whose implementation is now being postponed. There would be also gains from labor productivity. However, these gains were expected to materialize over a decade, maybe, or longer. And the reason for that is that the elimination of tariffs, which is something that can be achieved rather quickly, has already taken place. The remaining tariffs are not very large. So the biggest bang for the shilling would be achieved really through the elimination of non-tariff barriers. When I'm talking about non-tariff barriers, I mean market circumstances that require upfront investment in infrastructure, for instance, changes in business practices and in logistics. These are all very costly initiatives that take time to be financed, implemented, and to bear fruit. Another reason to be optimistic is that innovation has been happening very quickly, including during the pandemic and the lockdowns, and this provides a basis for future integration and growth. We have seen countries retooling their economies to produce some essential goods whose supply has been interrupted during the pandemic, and this indicates increased economic flexibility. So in some sense, COVID-19 has provided impetus for transformation. In Uganda, for instance, we have witnessed increased use of mobile money and the facilitation of electronic infrastructure development. And other countries have used, for instance, drones in most innovative ways, including to police lockdowns, for instance. So these are some nascent within-country innovations that can be exploited at the regional level to overcome market fragmentation going forward. However, I would like to leave with a note of caution. We know that these transformation processes, precisely because they are so revolutionary, they bring with them some unintended consequences that will hopefully be temporary. What we could expect to happen in the medium term is some increase in unemployment, and with it increase in poverty. And therefore, we have to be very cautious and very ambitious in implementing those policies that will make labor markets more flexible, but also more inclusive.
So we have, what we've heard there is that we have some reasons to be optimistic about regionalization, notwithstanding some of the short-term shifts that we're seeing away from regionalization. I'd like to come and get Barbara back in the conversation, looking at the regional markets from your eyes, Barbara, because your businesses, your membership at UMA, see the market as regional,
Right.
And how are they responding, do you think, to what's happening? Mm-hmm. Is the opportunity growing or not growing?
On the neighborhood or on Africa as a whole?
Both. We have the African Free Trade Agreement, we have the EAC agreement.
Yes. I think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, like you said, it's going a little bit backwards.
Yes.
And that's because I believe it's, as you know, it will work when there are no non-tariff barriers that countries put up. Because this continent, I think, as you mentioned, we have a population of 1.3 billion people. But it's also a market, a traded market of about $2.5 trillion. Now, if you can say that half of that will be produced locally by companies within Africa, that has a huge impact on our economies and also on our people, employment and everything that goes with that. So it is important that that happens. Now, what needs to be done is, I think, supporting some of these regional organizations, whether it's East African Community, SADC, and all that. They have to be strengthened to understand that you can protect your industry, but it's important that you work towards cooperation. So how do you do that? I think all these countries have they have export promotion boards. So you don't want to get in a position where I'm protecting mine and then you won't come in. But I think we need to sit together and say, all right, what is it, for political reasons or for whatever reasons, there's some industries that you're going to have to protect. But I do believe that there's still going to be industries and products that we can still trade in. Even if we have protectionism, I still believe that there are still opportunities. So it's really about that point that I talk about, cooperation. We need to just be able to talk to each other is important as a continent. And then on the regional side, in our neighborhood, in the East African neighborhood, it's important that we realize that the countries are at different levels. So if I look at Congo, and if I look at all the products that Congo brings in from Europe, that can actually be provided from the region, the East African region, the same neighborhood. Why don't we do that? And I think with this pandemic, it showed that, well, actually, it's been locked up. So they've had to think about it. And, they've been, Uganda Air Cargo, I think, is doing a good job and everything like that. But all in all, it's important to understand that your neighborhood, you have to be good neighbors. And then you have to be, and part of being a good neighbors is being able to not only talk to each other, but also to trade with each other so that you can actually build up that industry. The last point is that I'll talk about is somebody told me something that was quite interesting. He says, you know what? We can actually have an African car. But in order to have an African car, it's not one country that is going to actually make that African car. But it's what everybody, all the 55 states, what each and every one of those states can bring to building that car, kind of like the Airbus model. So this is that is important going forward. These are the things that we need to understand, that perhaps we can't do all things individually, but together we can come up and build that. So for instance, I don't know, if Congo has a lot of rubber, maybe they could make the tires, or if another country has got some technology, South Africa, maybe, to your point about IT, that they could develop that. Nigeria could give us the fantastic oil. I don't know, but that's, I think, how it's going to work. We've got to have these common initiatives or something that is going to bring us together, to work together to develop these.
I mean, listening to you talk, Barbara, it strikes me, the question that goes through my mind is, does the private sector here have a strong enough voice? Because I hear you speak about these ideas, and the question that goes through my mind is, why have we not done it already?
It is a process. It is a process. It needs the private sector. It needs government, which I think our government has been able to look at this. And then it needs to have the neighbors also think about this. So it needs, but sometimes the civil servants need to wake up a little bit and understand that because I think the private sector sees it, and I think some leaders might see it. But where we have the blockage is in some of the individuals who can make a difference in the various how do I say it?
Yes, I think you're right. It's a partnership, really, between what the public sector can do or government can do
Yes.
in terms of economic policy
Yes.
and creating the enabling environment
Okay.
for the private sector.
Yes, that's what's important.
I think you make a good point. And I was saying at the outset that Kennedy brings a kind of regional perspective view of Africa as well. And it'll be very interesting to get Kennedy's perspective on this regional opportunity that might exist within Africa.
Yes. Now, the region creates opportunities for countries to trade, even the continent itself. So the East Africa community has a significantly recognizable market. So is the African market. But we seem to, every 10 steps we seem to make 15 steps backwards. So the non-tariff barriers are a big issue that is affecting our country's ability to trade. But also, the trade aspect has focused only on liberalizing trade in goods without liberalizing trade in services or movement of people. So in a regional integration setting where you reduce restrictions for imports, the countries that have immediate capacity to produce are the ones that immediately benefit. So the issue of benefiting from free trade or regional integration, in the long run we benefit, but in the long run we will not be there. So what happens in the short run? In the short run, there are winners and losers. The winners are those that have immediate production capacity. So if you have two countries, one that is highly developed, the other that is less developed, which is the case in a number of African countries, the one that is highly developed would immediately be able to exploit opportunities in the country that is not developed. So it has happened. That's why you find that in a number of countries you have shops from South Africa or other neighboring countries that are better off than others. So what happened was the small bottle store that was owned by your uncles and your aunts and so on closed. So when it closed, we are all buying from imported products, which means we are creating employment in another country. Now, the shop that closed, it means somebody is unemployed. So what do you do with that unemployed person? If you were in the US where there are no borders between states, the person will be able to move from California to Arizona, from Arizona to Texas. That is not the case here. When that person loses a job, that person is on his or her own. What do they do now? In a number of cases, then they have to migrate to illegally, as they call it, to another country. It's happening in Europe. That's why some of our citizens end up in Europe. It's happening in Southern Africa. That's why a lot of neighbors are going to South Africa, because you've only liberalized goods, you have not liberalized movement of people. Now, the reason I'm bringing the issue of winners and losers, and where we come in as Africa Development Bank, is to provide an enabling environment to ensure that we develop the infrastructure necessary in those low-income countries so that manufacturing centers can move from expensive developed areas to low-cost areas. So, for example, if we take hypothetically, assuming Kenya is a high-cost area, Nairobi, and then Sudan is a low-cost center of production. Why you cannot move to southern Sudan now is because when you think of electricity and all those things and the border barriers, for a businessman doesn't make sense. But if you have the necessary infrastructure in Sudan and in South Sudan, for example, the business person would say, I'll invest in South Sudan, produce in South Sudan, and then export to Kenya. Theoretically, that's how it should work out. But in practice, that's not where we are. So one would ask, so what is the benefit of this free trade agreement for South Sudan? Because all politics is local. You have to convince your local electorate. They will tell you that there's no benefit. So as a politician, at the end of the day, you start lobbying to create barriers for imports. And that is what is happening. But if you see the benefit, you're saying from this free trade agreement, we are receiving this infrastructure. We are building roads, we are building power transmission lines, and so on. Therefore, businesses are going to come to our country and we're going to produce from this country. It's going to be a win-win. It's easy to sell to the local electorate. So in as much as we're talking about regional integration, yes, it's regional integration in name. The actual integration is done at national level. How do you convince your local citizens to saying that, okay, there are benefits from this regional integration? The same would apply for the Africa Free Trade Agreement. For as long as there are infrastructure disparities between countries, the countries that will be losing in the short term will immediately go into policy reversal. And that's what we've been seeing in East Africa. Because countries that immediately benefit should be able, to a certain extent, contribute to a fund that would build infrastructure in those countries. When you look at Europe, for example, Germany, France, they invested a lot into the European Investment Bank, and that money was used to fund infrastructure in Portugal, in Spain, and in Ireland. These were the less or lower income countries in Europe. And because of that, we found that a lot of investments now moved from Germany or France to produce in Ireland, to produce in Spain, to produce in Portugal. Now, for as long as in Africa, the big countries who are the immediate beneficiaries are not able to contribute, to sacrifice, or for lack of a better word again, a little bit in order to develop the neighbor who is poor would always have their citizens moving to the rich countries. And then the neighbor who is rich would be spending a lot of resources trying to catch up the so-called illegal immigrants and sending them back. But that money you're using to police the illegal immigrants, why not use that money to provide infrastructure to the neighbor so that the neighbor is able to produce and the people don't have to cross the border? I don't think that there is anyone who wants to cross the border illegally. I don't think there is anyone who wants to swim across the Mediterranean to look for jobs on any good day to Europe. If we have the jobs on the continent, we have the jobs with the neighboring countries, I think it will be a win-win for everyone. So for regional integration to benefit, for Africa Free Trade to benefit, we need to have a mechanism which will be welfare enhancing to develop infrastructure in the low-income countries so that they can see the benefit of a free trade agreement. Thank you.
All right, good. Well, moving on, Noah, we're probably going to end with you. I mean, I've heard you speak very passionately about innovating the Africa we want. How are we doing?
It's baby steps. We are in a place whereby now where we're trying to bring every piece that is needed to see tangible change on ground. And I think we are getting there. I mentioned earlier, you earlier mentioned about the fourth industrial revolution and how we are now getting to the tail end of the third industrial revolution and its giants, Apple, Google, and Microsoft and the likes. And now we are ushering in the fourth industrial revolution. And I believe that is the Africa revolution. And I'm bold enough to say that because the numbers are on our side. We don't have the baggage of the third industrial revolution, and so we are lighter, we can run faster. And that is both a challenge to us, but also an opportunity. Now, how are we doing on it? I can narrow it at the subsistence level on what we are doing and how we are responding as an organization as Savannah. And we are seeing that even when we talk about blockchain, one of the fourth industrial revolution technologies, and we look at how Africa is embracing this new technology, we're doing that much faster than the incumbents, than the big European countries and the Western countries. And just a few years ago, our president hosted the Africa Blockchain Conference, and he went and made bold statements about how the benefit that blockchain can bring to the Uganda government, our own very own president. That was the first time a head of state had made such a proclamation.
Yes.
And a few months later, the president of South Africa made similar remarks. And so you can see, and if you just simply Google blockchain Africa, you'll see the work that is happening in Uganda in adopting these technologies. We have big, both private sector organizations embracing blockchain at their core level and its advantages. Even government, some agencies are already looking deeply into how blockchain can bring better transparency to supply chains, better efficiency of services. And so we're seeing that adoption at a subsistence level. Now, what we need to do is to see that scale. We are now getting to the tail end of experimentation of these new technologies, and we are getting into now, let's see them in production. Let's see the value that they bring. And so that's what I'm seeing happening in Africa, in Uganda specifically. When you just look at the African continent, you see hotspots in South Africa, hotspots in Kenya, hotspots in South Africa, hotspots in Kenya, in Nigeria, in embracing these new technologies. A study was done by Intel and on what's happening in terms of AI in Africa. And so they conducted this study, and they took, they went to South Africa, they went to Egypt, they went to Kenya, they went to Nigeria. And then because the person who was running the study just happens to be Ugandan, it's like, have you checked what's happening in Uganda? It's like, okay, let's just go see what's happening in Uganda. And lo and behold, we had products. Artificial intelligence that can look at a plant and tell that it's prone to disease. And we had, artificial intelligence being used for air quality studies. And we had products. And so when we looked around the continent, we were the most advanced. The artificial intelligence school out of Makerere was the most advanced, and they won accolades. They're actually under currently a Google sponsorship because of the work that they're doing. So we are embracing this, and we have history. We embraced mobile technology much faster than the rest of the world. We embraced mobile transactions, mobile money, much faster than the rest of the world. And we're taking that learning, we're taking that habit into these fourth industrial revolutions. That's why I had the boldness to say that the fourth industrial revolution is the African one. But we need that support. Both the support of the people that have gone before us, the barons and the baronesses of the third industrial revolution, to pave the way for us young people. So that when we get to that youth dividend, we have all the momentum behind us driving the Africa that we want to see. And so that's my passion, and that's why I speak so passionately about it, because I believe we are in the perfect storm of events that are going to see a new Africa rise. But that's also where the caveat comes in. If we don't take that opportunity, the rest of the world are going to see that potential. And we might just go into another age of slavery, or digital slavery, where we're just consumers of these digital products, yet we could be the creators.
That's a good note to end on. A new Africa rising.
Yes.
It's interesting how all our panelists have alluded to some caution, but also I think there is a sense of optimism amongst all of us. And there are things that we need to be careful of, but also things we need to plan for. Let's not let a good crisis go to waste.
Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.